Dragons bellowed above Thousand-Leaf City. Dragons bellowed above Thousand-Leaf City. In the upper sky, holy golden dragons marched forward across the sky dome, their rumbles shaking the air. The people in the city all looked up to the sky, shocked by the scene. Many people were standing on the holy golden dragons' backs. The man who was riding the giant dragon at the forefront was Prince Regent. His gold-embroidered official robe was blowing in the wind. His appearance was solemn, dignified, and imposing. Those riding on other dragons were all warriors of the Saint Plain, strong cultivators in the Dali imperial clan. As the dragons approached the Lord's residence, far in front of them, a group of people stood in the void sky waiting for their arrival. Obviously, their envoy had been spotted. The man who stood in the front of the group was Lu Yu, a Nirvana Plane warrior of Emperor Xia's realm. In Emperor Xia's realm, Lu Yu's name was not known by many people. He was Emperor Xia's bodyguard who had followed Emperor Xia for many years. Since Emperor Xia had been accepted as Renhuang, Lu Yu was in charge of protecting princes and princesses. He took charge of Princess Xia Qingyuan's protection during the Battle of Empty Realm. One could even say that he was Princess Xia Qingyuan's invisible guard. For him, Xia Qingyuan's safety was always the biggest priority. Today, he'd led warriors of Emperor Xia's realm to stop Prince Regent. Seeing the roaring golden dragons coming, Lu Yu released purple light. Dazzling golden rays also flashed in the thick purple radiance. At the moment, seeing the parade of roaring dragons marching forward, Lu Yu moved both hands. Suddenly, a giant halo appeared in the upper sky and kept expanding to encompass the whole sky. The halo lay above the sky dome and blocked the roaring dragon's way. Prince Regent stared forward, perceiving a slight threat. He said coldly, "Lu Yu, for so many years you've been following Emperor Xia, but now you have neither fame or status. How about swearing allegiance to Dali today? I promise that His Majesty Emperor Li will confer a noble title to you." He, as the Prince Regent of the Dali Empire, was familiar with the names of the top figures in Emperor Xia's realm, except for those godlike ones in seclusion. Whether it was in Emperor Xia's realm or the Dali Empire, there were very few cultivators who could enter the Nirvana Plane. Prince Regent could count them on one hand, so he naturally recognized Lu Yu. Lu Yu ignored Prince Regent's voice, drawing two palm prints instead of answering. Suddenly, the giant purple-gold halo expanded. Inside, the horrifying rays of purple and gold rumbled and surged. The might of the law converged and formed thunderclouds above the earth. The sky looked as if it was heralding the end times. Die. When Lu Yu said the word, rays of purple and gold shot out of the boundless purple halo, pierced through the sky dome, and headed toward the roaring golden dragons. "Everyone be careful," said Prince Regent as he walked into the air. Countless golden dragons rumbled and fought their ways out, but when the purple light arrived, the rays passed straight through the dragons' bodies. The magnificent purple light was like a celestial blade, chopping the dragons up. Bam! Prince Regent stomped in the air, shaking the sky and the earth. The golden dragons appeared once again, roaring and surging between the sky and earth. After a horrifying shout, a 10,000-foot-long golden dragon with 5 claws appeared behind Prince Regent, circling his body. Its enormous body spiraled up. Its giant head looked down on all beings in the world below. The dragon was full of imposing might, like the forebearer of all dragons. The Sword Master of Lihin is also here. It seems like Emperor Xia's realm is fully prepared. "You are here to kill the Dali Prince, aren't you?" Prince Regent asked, sneering. He suddenly realized that if Li Yao had not received the message about going back and had gone to kill Yi Futian, he might have had bad results. It was very likely that he would have not returned. The people of Emperor Xia's realm were conspiring against him. That is to say, Yi Futian was conspiring against him. Emperor Xia and Princess Xia Qingyuan of Emperor Xia's realm treated Yi Futian well. The girl must have been in love with him. Prince Regent's steps made the sky and earth tremble. He extended one palm. The giant holy dragon behind him followed his actions, the 5 claws smashing down. A reflection of the 10,000-foot-long dragon also appeared above the sky dome and swiped down with its claws. In front of the golden claws, Lu Yu's figure was so small it seemed like he would be torn to pieces. Lu Yu raised his head and looked straight ahead. The purple halo around his body blew up and released a horrifying amount of energy. Endless rays formed a ring and converged into one beam of light that projected ahead like a purple sword, but this was much sharper than a sword. Boom! A loud sound was heard, shaking the sky dome. The sharp claws and rays of purple and gold collided violently. The scene froze in time as an aura of destruction arose. The holy golden dragon's claws were torn apart as the rays of light dimmed and broke apart. Prince Regent snorted and continued forward as if nothing in the world could stop him. Lu Yu wouldn't take a step back. The purple rays kept soaring up, roaring through the air. While the battle was going on, in another part of the world, the great shaman was leading warriors into the upper sky to wait for their opponent's arrival. The approaching Dali Imperial Advisor and his warriors formed the main fighting force of this battle. The third prince and other warriors of the Dali Empire were all in this legion. Their powerful might overarched the sky. The Dali Imperial warriors paused in front of the great shaman. They looked straight at their enemies with piercing eyes. The Dali Imperial Advisor looked at the great shaman. Both of them were the most powerful figures of their respective camps. Another Nirvana Plane cultivator stood next to the Dali Imperial Advisor. It was the ex-lord of Li City, Yen Kun. Yen Kun's eyes fell upon the person standing opposite him, the ex-lord of Thousand Leaves City, Shen Tianzhan. He hadn't expected Shen Tianzhan to join the battle. The Dali Imperial Advisor hadn't done anything to Yen Kun after taking his city. The Dali Imperial Advisor had treated him with respect, so Yen Kun quite admired him. Li Yao had also provided him with great recompense, so he decided to join the battle between the Renhuang realms. Had Shen Tianzhan had a similar experience? The third prince of the Dai Empire, Li Zhen, looked at the first prince of Emperor Xia's realm, Xia Rong. It seemed that they had chosen their opponents at first sight. The Dali third prince had an extremely high status in Dali. His talent and cultivation even surpassed that of his two elder brothers. He was thought to be the most likely to inherit Empire Li's empire. Xia Rong, as the first prince of Emperor Xia's realm, was also extremely outstanding. Before Xia Qingyuan was born, he'd been thought to be the most promising inheritor of Emperor Xia's realm. He joined the army for cultivation and had built an iron-blooded charisma and extraordinary martial ability there. Many people in Emperor Xia's realm admired and respected him. It was because Xia Qingyuan was the only princess that Emperor Xia pampered her a lot. Emperor Xia had once announced that Xia Qingyuan's talent was equal to his, so many people thought Xia Qingyuan would become Emperor Xia's successor. But that would all depend on their own cultivation achievement. Whoever could be proved as being at the Renhuang level would naturally become the successor of the empire. But at this moment on the battlefield, Li Zhen and Xia Rong were undoubtedly the best opponents for each other. They stared at each other with piercing eyes, the strong battle will emanating from their bodies. Yi Futian snuck into the Dali Empire under the fake identity of a Dali cultivator, the seventh sword. He secretly studied our cultivation method and broke the rules. Xia Rong, I will let you go if you hand Yi Futian over to me, said Li Zhen to Xia Rong. Li Yao sent people to assassinate Yi Futian after he was defeated in the Battle of Empty Realm. Didn't that also break the rules? I should ask you to hand Li Yao over, said Xia Rong coldly. Yi Futian didn't do anything wrong in Dali. If Li Yao is killed, it will be because he deserves it. Fight if you want to. Stop talking nonsense. Li Zhen sneered. Xia Rong's attitude was tough indeed. No wonder he was a prince leading an army. I have heard a lot about you, first prince of Emperor Xia's realm. Today, please show me how strong you are, said Li Zhen, taking one step forward like an ancient dragon. The might emanating from his body was horrifying. He looked very handsome. An aura as intimidating as his was rare in that era. Xia Rong stepped forward, his long hair blowing in the wind. The iron will to kill emanated from his body. Both of them had dominating halos as noble princes, but their murderous wills were very different. They stepped forward and walked toward each other. No one came to intervene in their battle. It was a duel between the prince of Emperor Li's realm and the prince of Emperor Xia's realm. They didn't want to be interrupted either. Without showy skills, Li Zhen and Xia Rong walked toward each other and both threw a punch. Li Zhen launched a punch that packed the power of a dragon whose low roar echoed between the sky and earth. When the one punch came out, a horrifying wave swept out, shattering everything in front of him into pieces. It was as if the flow followed the fluctuation of the natural law and was meant to destroy everything. There was an ancestral dragon standing behind Li Zhen. However, at this moment, no one could steal his thunder. He was peerless in the world. The power was grinding forward, igniting the void sky. Xia Rong employed the skill of 33 layers of Huangting Fist Will. The first punch he threw maintained 22 layers of Huangting Fist Will. One after another, the following punches grew stronger and stronger, like sea waves smashing the coast. When the blows landed, the void sky was radically shaken. An invisible air current swept out and shook the sky and earth violently. The fist will was totally smashed into power. Fierce hurricanes fell upon the princes' bodies. Their hair and clothes blew wildly in the wind. Nothing in the world could stop them. It was a duel between the two most outstanding princes of Emperor Xia's realm and Emperor Li's realm. All of a sudden, a large space appeared from other battlefields. It seemed as if the other warriors intentionally sought their corresponding opponents to let two princes fight the duel. Above the void in the sky, two figures appeared over the sky dome, far away from anyone else. It was the Dali Imperial Advisor and the Great Shaman. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Dali Imperial Advisor and the Great Shaman stood opposite each other in the upper sky. Imperial Advisor wore a Taoist robe, and the Great Shaman was dressed in a cloak. Dali Imperial Advisor and the Great Shaman stood opposite each other in the upper sky. Imperial Advisor wore a Taoist robe, and the Great Shaman was dressed in a cloak. The Great Shaman took off the hood, revealing his fair face. I know you cherish talents and that you once escorted Yi Futian back to Emperor Xia's realm. Why did you have to come here to suffer today? Asked the Great Shaman. I am the Imperial Advisor of Dali. I must take a stand, replied the Dali Imperial Advisor. The Great Shaman nodded slightly. He guessed that the Dali Imperial Advisor probably hadn't come willingly. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had to escort Yi Futian. He knew that Dali Imperial Advisor had taught his own cultivation method, deed of thorough comprehension, to Yi Futian, which meant that he regarded Yi Futian as his successor. Additionally, he'd escorted Yi Futian to Emperor Xia's realm in person, which brought the Dali people's suspicion on him. The Great Shaman admired him for his big heart even though the Imperial Advisor was now his opponent. Imperial Advisor, please, said the Great Shaman. He held the crozier in his hand, his expression turning serious. Although the Great Shaman admired him, they were on the battlefield. The Dali Imperial Advisor was considered the strongest person after Emperor Li of Dali. He was very likely stronger than King Tiandao if he had no match in Dali beside Emperor Li. Not to mention the Imperial Advisor's status in Dali. The Great Shaman would have to do all he could to fight against such a strong opponent. As the Dali Imperial Advisor had said, he had to take a stand. This battle was not about what was right and what was wrong. It was all about the different sides. He didn't think that the Dali Imperial Advisor would show any mercy, so he wouldn't either. Please, said the Dali Imperial Advisor. After he said the word, the mind of the Great Law started to flow above the sky dome. All of a sudden, a boundless 5 elements 8 trigram formed around the Dali Imperial Advisor's body. Ancient characters appeared on the pattern in the sky. Qian, Kun, Yin. The sky and earth had 5 elements. The Great Law ran between Qian, the sky, and Kun, the earth. The boundless pattern was running by itself. The Dali Imperial Advisor's clothes blew in the wind as he stood above the sky dome. The mind of the Great Law flew into his body. It seemed as if the whole world was under his command. It was the Dali Imperial Advisor's cultivation method, the deed of thorough comprehension. Many people perceived this horrifying might of Great Law and looked up to the sky, shocked. The Dali Imperial Advisor and the Great Shaman chose to battle in the upper air in case their battle affected other people. Of their own record, they left the battlefield and went into the upper sky. A golden lotus flower appeared around the Great Shaman's body. The petals of the lotus flower stretched out and bloomed, expanding as if it was the lotus of the Great Law itself. An endless boulevard of lotus flowers blossomed in the air, sensing the Great Law. They spread across every corner of the world, lotus flowers growing everywhere. The endless lotus flowers even surrounded Dali Imperial Advisor's enormous 5-element 8-trigram. Magnificent golden threads sprouted from the endless lotuses and stretched out to shroud Dali Imperial Advisor. The golden threads moved extremely fast, like thin swords piercing through the void sky, trying to envelop everything inside, including the Dali Imperial Advisor's body. The Dali Imperial Advisor saw the scene and raised both his hands to the sky. Suddenly, the pattern of the Great Law launched, following the movement of his hands. Ancient characters flew from them. The character Qian kept growing until it turned into a spell of the Great Law, enveloping the sky. It lay over the sky dome and supported the whole sky. At the same time, he stomped on the ground. Suddenly, the character Kun fell and turned into the land, sealing the space below it. The Dali Imperial Advisor was the manifestation of the Great Law. He had nothing to fear between the sky and the earth. He took a step forward and suddenly turned into the incarnation of the thunder deity. The character Jin darted out and summoned the thunder catastrophe from the ninth sky. He dropped it to the great shaman, sweeping out and destroying the incoming golden threads. His body followed the movement of the wind. The sky and earth roared and raised a storm of the Great Law, sweeping out and quickly rushing toward the great shaman's body with the pattern of the Great Law. Nothing could stop it. The great shaman looked at Dali Imperial Advisor. He was approaching him at an extremely high speed, carrying the Great Law, like a deity arriving. It was said in Emperor Xia's realm that the Dali Imperial Advisor was trained in various skills, even evil ones. He could do it all and cultivate using different methods. This was the first time he'd ever battled with the Dali Imperial Advisor face to face. Of course, the great shaman would not take hearsay as truth, but he had to admit that the Dali Imperial Advisor was talented at various cultivation methods. The lotuses transformed into all the beings of the world. The great shaman held the crozier in his hand. Endless golden radiance shone in front of his chest and converged into a sword of the Great Law, tearing apart the void sky. He stretched out the crozier, and the sword of the Great Law moved forward too. All of a sudden, it pierced through the void sky, tearing it apart. It became tangled by the countless golden threads which ripped the sky and earth in half. Boom! The omnipresent celestial thundercloud of the ninth sky was almost trying to destroy the world. The Dali Imperial Advisor was devouring the Great Law of the sky and the earth. The character Jin surrounded the world as he transformed into an ultimate thunder god. He pointed his finger, causing countless characters to move. The sword and the fingertips collided. The giant sword that had shaken the void sky and pierced through the thundercloud shattered into pieces. The Imperial Advisor continued walking forward. His eyes looked toward the great shaman, telling him that nothing could stop his forward movement. Below them, numerous people looked up to the sky, still shocked. How powerful the Dali Imperial Advisor was. He deployed the Great Law as his matrix. Qian, the sky, Kun, the land, and the 5 elements of the Great Law all listened to his order. The Great Law entered his body. He became an alchemy furnace for the Great Law of sky and earth. His hands could support the sky, his feet could push the land, his body could become a thunder god, and his power was ultimate. With just one finger, he could eliminate the great shaman's sword. There was a holy aura surrounding his body. Xia Qingyuan looked up to the battle in the sky and felt slightly stirred by the scene. The great shaman's strength had been acknowledged by her father. Among the cultivators of the Nirvana plane, he was a top figure. However, the great shaman was obviously having a hard time in this battle with the Dali Imperial Advisor, proving how powerful the Imperial Advisor was. From this, one could tell that it was very likely that Dali had stronger top figures than Emperor Xia's realm. If a war between the two realms broke out, according to his strength, the Dali Imperial Advisor wouldn't find any equal opponent in Emperor Xia's realm except Renhuang. While the battle was going on between the Dali Imperial Advisor and the Great Shaman, Prince Li Zhen and Prince Xia Rong were also fighting in the void sky. On another battlefield, Yan Kuan and Shen Tianzhan, two ex-lords of the cities, had also started to fight. Both of them were local cultivators of the Crimson Dragon realm and were good at using the great law of fire. When they battled, their blazing fires burned the air. The sky dome turned hotter as they suppressed the sky and earth. Many people had to retreat further. The ones with weak cultivation ability had to run away. It was not safe for them to stay and watch. Besides these top figures, many people of the two sides had joined the battlefield. A breathtaking battle between Saint Plain cultivators had also broken out. Even the warriors of the two cities, like the people of the Situ clan, had joined the battle. The scene was becoming more turbulent as the fire of war kept spreading. Fierce battles broke out everywhere in the center district of Thousand Leaves City, terrifying many people. Who is that person? His ability was so strong. At this time, many people fixed their eyes on one cultivator in particular who was using a sword. His swordsmanship was extremely aggressive. His every thrash showed such strong force that it could have split up the void sky. Xia Qingyuan noticed him too. The person in black was of the unblemished Saint Plain. He controlled the sword perfectly when he attacked. He won the battle with the lord of the Situ clan and almost chopped the man's arm off. Mu Chunyang, the Dali Imperial Advisor's third disciple. The person's name came to Xia Qingyuan's mind. He was Yi Futian's elder brother while Yi Futian cultivated in Dali. Xia Qingyuan frowned. The Dali Imperial Advisor's third disciple. The message she had received said that, other than the second disciple, all of Imperial Advisor's disciples would come. So where was the Dali Imperial Advisor's most outstanding first disciple, Yan Yuan? Her eyes kept searching the battlefields, but she couldn't find anyone similar to Yan Yuan. If any of the Imperial Advisor's disciples were present, they would be very eye-catching. However, on the large battlefields, other than the third prince, Li Zhen, she only spotted Mu Chunyang. Yan Yuan was absolutely not here. As Xia Qingyuan realized that Yan Yuan was not there, many people of the Dali Empire also lost Yi Futian's trace. This time, Dali hadn't let Li Yao come to protect him, so had Emperor Xia's realm intentionally let Yi Futian avoid this battle, too? In one spot on the battlefield, so much demonic will surge that it looked like an ultimate demonic figure would soon come. His body violently broke out from the demonic flows. He was only a doctrine saint, but his imposing appearance as he took a step forward was terrifying. A Dali doctrine saint raised one hand and sent giant palm prints toward him, but the demonic cultivator directly bumped his body toward the prince. With a loud sound, the palm prints completely smashed. The demonic cultivator threw a punch and punched through the sky and the earth. The Dali member of the Saint Plain defended it by hand. But with a cracking sound, the punch broke his arm and struck through his chest. He was knocked back a distance and dropped to the ground feebly. That Dali figure was Yu Sheng. Beside him, Yi Wuchen, who had entered the Saint Plain, joined the battle. At the Lord's residence, Gu Donglu and Zhuge Mingyue stood shoulder to shoulder in a pavilion. Gu Donglu looked up at the battlefields in the void sky. A magnificent light ran around his body, but he did not seem able to perceive it as he looked toward the battlefields above him. The battle between the Dali Imperial Advisor and the Great Shaman, the battle between Yan Kuan and Shen Tianzhan, the battle between Li Zhen and Xia Rong, Mu Chunyang's battle, First Brother's battle, and Yu Sheng's battle. All these stunning battles were in full view. All of these battles were between cultivators of the Saint Plain. The flow of light around his body shined brighter. The life force of the Saint Plain emanated through the air. Wisps of Saint Might wrapped around his body. His mind traveled into the distance and blended with the air. Above the sky dome, a thunderstorm raged. A catastrophe was about to come. Zhuge Mingyue looked up to the sky, the tinge of a bright smile flashing in her eyes. Finally, he would enter the Saint Plain too. Little Brother and Yu Sheng had each gradually entered the Saint Plain, but Gu Donglu was not anxious and cultivated at his own pace. He believed that he would one day enter the Saint Plain too. He was patiently waiting for the day to come in a natural way. Now as he watched the Battle of Great Law, he was finally able to break the last barrier, get a thorough and intact insight into the necessary state of mind, and enter the Saint Plane. Many people were surprised when they saw the scene. He'd entered the Saint Plane during the battle. But even though he'd entered Saint Plane, it couldn't affect the situation on the battlefield very much. After all, the warriors in the battle between the two Renhuang realms were all on the Saint Plane. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. In the Lord's residence, Li City. In the Lord's residence, Li City. Li Yao stood on the rooftop of the palace and looked in the direction of Thousand Leaves City. Of course, no matter how high his cultivation level was, he couldn't see the battlefields in Thousand Leaves City due to the enormous size of the Crimson Dragon realm. To achieve their goal, Prince Regent joined the battle as 3 Nirvana Plane warriors reached the Crimson Dragon realm. Such a battle array was intimidating in itself. The Dali Imperial Advisor, Prince Regent, and the number 1 demonic figure in Dali, Chao Kong, were each strong enough to dominate many cities of Crimson Dragon realm. Except for ancient Imperial City, no city could defend against them. Plus, former Lord Yen Kun was also with them. Even though Yi Futian had made preparations, he shouldn't be able to handle 4 Nirvana Plane warriors. Besides, no one in Emperor Xia's realm was comparable with the Dali Imperial Advisor in terms of strength. Of course, the Imperial Advisor had to try his best during the battle. However, since Prince Regent, the 3rd Prince, and the other warriors were all present, the Imperial Advisor would have to put all his efforts into fighting. After all, there was no way that the Imperial Advisor could retreat this time. At this moment, many figures were flying in the air and heading toward the Lord's residence. Li Yao glanced up and noticed them, causing him to frown slightly. It seemed as if some people were trying to approach the Lord's residence. Outside the Lord's residence, a person in a black cloak was sitting quietly. Like a ghost, his face was obscured as if it had been absorbed by a black hole. He seemed extremely dangerous. Wisps of dark mist circled his body, but it was not demonic flow. Rather, it was more like the will of death. The figure in the darkness looked like a death god who'd come there to reap souls. Inside the Lord's residence, Li Yao leaped up and looked outside. When he saw the dark figure waiting outside, his face suddenly turned sullen. Thousand Leaves City was in the midst of a fatal battle, but they'd still had time to send warriors to the Lord's residence of Xiang City. Had the person outside come to kill him? Perhaps sensing that he was being observed, the figure shrouded in darkness slightly raised his head. Within the dark mist, a pair of eyes appeared from within the cloak. With just one glance, he gave Li Yao a taste of the death god's arrival. Li Yao suddenly felt himself falling into the endless abyss, unable to escape from it. The sense of impending doom ran through his body. Suddenly, a hand patted Li Yao on the shoulder, causing an eruption of light. Li Yao was awakened, his face pale. He looked down at the dark shadow walking step by step into the Lord's residence. "Sir," Li Yao called to Yen Yuan, terror in his eyes. "Your Highness, please back off." "Allow me to handle this," said Yen Yuan. Li Yao knew that this person was very dangerous and that he would not able to deal with him. He had been able to sense the arrival of death with just a single glance. But since the Dali Imperial Advisor's first disciple, Yen Yuan, was here, he shouldn't need to worry. However, because of Yi Futian, he had stood against the Imperial Advisor. Even so, he still trusted the Imperial Advisor and Sir Yen Yuan's strength from the bottom of his heart. The feeling was strange since he had chosen to fight against them, yet he still felt safe with Yen Yuan standing next to him. Yi Futian should have had that kind of feeling too as Yen Yuan escorted him away. Li Yao sighed to himself. If only there had been no Yi Futian. That year, he'd wanted to join the Imperial Advisor's residence and become the Imperial Advisor's disciple. But he knew things could never return to the way things were before. Yen Yuan stood next to Li Yao. He felt the same even though he knew that they had taken opposite stands. But he still had the responsibility of guarding Li Yao's safety. The dispute this time had arisen from the feud between Li Yao and Yi Futian. He knew that his master was not willing to kill Yi Futian, but that he had to do it due to his chosen side. Yen Yuan was in the same position. He had to protect Li Yao. He had definitively made up his mind that day after the conversation with his master. The Dali Imperial Advisor was under orders to come to the Crimson Dragon realm to capture Yi Futian, earning the title of Imperial Advisor Commander of Dali. What would happen if Li Yao died? Today, in Dali, things were no longer as they'd been before. Dali seemed to be interested in confronting Emperor Xia's realm this time. Emperor Li thought highly of the master, but he hoped that the Imperial Advisor could state his position clearly and follow Emperor Li's decision. Emperor Li had cast suspicion on the master because of what had happened last time. If the prince also died, Yan Yuan could not imagine what the outcome would be. So, nothing could happen to Li Yao. Yan Yuan looked at the person in front of him and asked, "Shadow Guard of Emperor Xia's realm, you didn't come here alone, did you?" "I've heard that the Dali Imperial Advisor's first disciple, Yan Yuan, is the strongest cultivator below the Nirvana plane in Dali. My name is Ji Yuan. I am the Shadow Guard commander of Emperor Xia's realm. I am here to see what I can learn from you," said Ji Yuan. Both people had a character, Yuan, in their names, so there was some karma between them. However, they stood on opposite sides. Ji Yuan had been the second top figure in the sage and saint rankings of the 9 states for many years. His ranking was lower than the great shamans, but he was so good at death skills that he had eventually infuriated Emperor Xia. After Emperor Xia stopped allowing him to establish orthodoxy, Ji Yuan had disappeared from the 9 states. After Emperor Xia punished him, he'd let him join the Shadow Guard. Ji Yuan, the death god, had since become the Shadow Guard commander and reached the apex of the unblemished saint plane, very close to the Nirvana level. He hardly appeared in public and didn't have widespread fame. Few people knew of his existence because those who saw his face usually died. "Please," Yan Yuan said, looking at him. His black robe was billowing in the wind. As Ji Yuan stepped forward, the wisps of death force rose and diffused toward the Lord's residence. The mist became thicker and thicker as the death god shrouded the place. Warriors of the Lord's residence released their might to defend against this incoming sense of death. Yan Yuan stared ahead, a dazzling, holy light shining over his body. As the Imperial Advisor's first disciple, he'd also cultivated on the deed of thorough comprehension. As an Imperial-level cultivation method, the deed of thorough comprehension contained deep and profound knowledge. What the Dali Imperial Advisor had taught Yi Futian was just a small part of it. When different people studied the deed of thorough comprehension, they gained different results. Yan Yuan put out one hand and waved. Suddenly, a glaring halo appeared in front of him and rapidly expanded. At the same time, Death God Ji Yuan pointed one finger outward. The sky and earth rumbled with the gesture. Innumerable flows of death force rose from other lands, enveloping the Lord's residence and sweeping toward Yan Yuan and Li Yao. Yan Yuan raised one palm. With that movement, the pattern grew bigger and bigger, seemingly about to devour the great law of the sky and the earth. The horrifying air flows of the great law between the sky and earth formed a halo pattern and enlarged. The halo kept expanding in the upper air, covering the sky. The innumerable flows of death force dripped down, all getting blocked by the pattern. At this moment, Yan Yuan reached out with his left hand and put his finger on the pattern of the great law. Suddenly, from the pattern, countless sharp swords emerged, piercing through the void sky and falling upon Ji Yuan. But his fingertips stayed on that pattern. The pattern of the great law spun, causing a giant sword to be born from it. At the next moment, the giant sword penetrated the space and thrust toward Ji Yuan, shaking the sky and earth. In just one moment, the tens of thousands of swords annihilated the flows of death force, ready to kill. Ji Yuan had no time to think. He held out both arms. The waves of dark flow rumbled and merged into a horrifying dark abyss in front of him, devouring the sword of the great law. The abyss was boundless enough to swallow all the swords. The Lord's residence was rapidly collapsing into the abyss. The swords all gradually disappeared as the devouring abyss roared and trembled. Finally, following an explosion, the sword will and the dark abyss crashed together, countless fragments breaking off and falling to the ground. Bam! Yan Yuan stepped into the void sky, lifting the halo pattern of the great law with one arm as he headed toward Ji Yuan. The pattern of the Great Law spun above the sky dome as it expanded. Inside was a huge matrix swallowing and spitting the horrible power. Ji-Yuan looked up at the void sky and felt like he was being crushed under the pattern of Great Law. Yen Yuan waved his hands and patted the matrix pattern, saying, "Jin." After he said the word, several giant golden swords appeared from the edge of the pattern of the Great Law. They emitted the radiance of obliteration as they slashed at the ground. The will of death roared wildly around Ji-Yuan. His body turned into black shadows and immediately vanished, trying to escape. However, the swords were not targeting him, they were attacking the whole area. Boom, boom, boom. Horrifyingly loud noises were heard. The giant swords slid into the sky and earth, sealing the space off. All of the swords that were connected by the matrix became part of the matrix pattern. When the dark mists tried to break in, they all were smashed into the void. In the Lord's residence, people gathered and watched the fight on the battlefield. The man who stood above the sky dome was truly peerless. He, the Dali Imperial Advisor's first disciple, was called the strongest cultivator below the Nirvana plane. Even though his opponent was the Shadow Guard commander, as long as Yen Yuan was there, no one could get past him to reach Li Yao. Seeing the scene, Li Yao sighed to himself and felt that he was fortune's fool. Before, he'd at least been able to call Yen Yuan elder brother. Now, he could only address him as Sir. Why did Yi Futian have to live in this world? Thinking about this, Li Yao's hatred of Yi Futian became even stronger. If Yi Futian had not pretended to be the seventh swordsman, all these things would not have happened. At this moment, Ji Yuan's body converged and reappeared. The dark mists roared around his body, the shadow of the death deity appearing behind him. He was best at death skills, but Yen Yuan didn't give him the chance to copy his ability. This imperial advisor's disciple was indeed powerful. He rose into the sky. The boundless shadow of the death god pressed a giant dark palm print onto the light curtain of the swords over the sky dome. After a loud noise, the light curtain tore the giant palm print apart. The palm print was slashed in half. However, at this moment, a divine sword flew straight out of the broken sword matrix and headed toward the sky dome. Soon, it slowly fell to the ground. Li Yao and many others raised their heads and took a look at the divine sword, perplexed. What did that mean? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. The flying sword was hanging in the void sky, sending out metallic clangs. It was apparently meant for Yen Yuan. The flying sword was hanging in the void sky, sending out metallic clangs. It was apparently meant for Yen Yuan. Yen Yuan raised his head and took a look at the sword. The sword seemed to be controlled by someone. At the same time, far away from there in the cultivation temple of the Lord's residence of Thousand Leaves City, a lady was sitting with her legs crossed. She was being bathed in endless sword will. Beneath her, the pattern of a sword matrix flickered. Suddenly, her eyelashes slightly fluttered, the pattern of the sword matrix lighting up. Instantly, the matrix pattern absorbed the sword will of the great law between the sky and earth. When that happened, all the swords around the lady began to ring. A horrible gust of storming sword will swept out and enveloped the boundless space. Some swordsmen in training felt the sword will around their bodies fly out of their control and head off in one direction. What happened? People fixed their eyes in one direction and froze there, their pupils contracting. All they could see a sword road forming above the sky dome. An endless void of sword will dripped down from the sky dome and flew to one location in the Lord's residence. The dazzling sword force was being discharged from that spot. In the void sky, the Dali Imperial Advisor was fighting with the great shaman. He took a look at his side and released his will. As he tried to make it follow the newly built sword road, his face turned slightly pale. The Imperial Advisor formed two palm prints and looked up to the sky. The giant character, Qian, flew out. He then spat and said, "Seal." The sky dome trembled after he said the word. It was as if the sky was trying to seal and shut down the sword road. However, at the same time, a dazzling beam of sword light rose up. Tens of thousands of swords darted down along the ancient sword road. The Dali imperial advisor used the character Qian to seal the sky. The torrents of sword law gushed out, trying to break the seal. The loud roll of thunder was heard, causing the sky and earth to tremble. However, the ancient character of the great law didn't shatter as it tried to seal the ancient sword road. At that moment, the lady's body blended into the halo pattern of the sword and turned into a beam of light, piercing the sky and shattering the Qian. The ancient road of sword law reappeared. The lady turned around and disappeared together with the sword matrix on the ancient road of the sword law. Only the massive sword will was left behind. This is, countless pairs of eyes froze on the ancient road of sword law from where the lady had just vanished. The scene was so shocking. What had just happened? A battle between two Renhuang realms, where so many Nirvana Plane warriors fought with each other, was a rare event even in the Crimson Dragon realm. It was a Renhuang-level battle. How could Emperor Xia's realm have prepared such a sword matrix when so many top figures had already been engaged in fighting? It would be extremely hard to defend against the sword matrix's attack. Thinking about this, Xiang Nan, who was standing with warriors of Emperor Xiang's realm, had a slight look of panic on his face. What Xia Rong had said was not merely a warning. Although Emperor Xiang's realm was powerful, few warriors were guarding Xiang City in the Crimson Dragon's realm. Among them, only one had reached the Nirvana Plane. In a battle of such a level, Xia Rong could eliminate Xiang Nan if he tried it first at all costs. The sword that had just appeared could easily execute anyone during the battle. It seemed to be prepared to kill on any battlefield at any time. But for now, it was not being used on this battlefield. Rather, it had pierced the sky, built a sword road in the air, and disappeared. In the Lord's residence of Li City, Yen Yuan looked up at the sword in the void sky as if he had perceived something. He turned around and said to the people nearby, "Escort His Highness away immediately." He couldn't stay here. Yen Yuan could sense how powerful and dangerous the force was. It could even be a threat to him. The sword that Ji Yuan used was the sword of guidance. "This way, please, Your Highness." They appeared in front of Li Yao, ready to escort him. Li Yao frowned slightly. Something in her eyes had changed. He could tell that Yen Yuan's tone had become serious. Was the situation so serious that even Yen Yuan was worried? Were more warriors of Emperor Xia's realm coming here? However, how could Emperor Xia's realm deploy top warriors here during a battle of such magnitude? But this was obviously not the moment to think too much. He jumped into the air and prepared to leave with his escorts. It seemed that his sage plane was not qualified enough to join this battlefield. At the same time, Yen Yuan looked down at Ji Yuan, who was covered by the matrix. His left hand smashed against the magnificent matrix of the Great Law again as he spat the word, "Hua." When he said the word, the matrix swallowed the flames of the Great Law between the sky and the earth. Even the blaze of the sun above the sky dome was drawn to the matrix and made part of it. All of a sudden, the flames swallowed the matrix and transformed into flame dragons which ran to Ji Yuan. The flame of the Great Law was trying to burn the space to ash. Ji Yuan looked at the magnificent matrix and frowned slightly. This Dali Imperial Advisor's top disciple had acquired the Imperial Advisor's skills, making him really tricky to deal with. There was no way to use his deathly methods in front of Yen Yuan. At this moment, the sword wills dripped down from the sky dome and fell on Yen Yuan's body. Although the will was not very strong yet, Yen Yuan could sense the great danger from it. Numerous swords came into sight above the sky dome and sealed off the sky. The faces of Li Yao and others turned pale as they looked up at the sky dome. Right above their heads, an ancient road of sword law with countless swords was dripping down from above. Yen Yuan's face suddenly turned pale. He immediately let Ji Yuan go and lifted the matrix pattern of the Great Law with both hands, rushing up into the sky. He lifted the matrix between the sky and earth with both hands. The matrix greedily swallowed the law of the sky and the earth as it kept expanding. It grew until it turned into a pattern that completely covered the sky. People in the lower sky all looked up and were shocked by what they saw. Yen Yuan was powerful indeed. A void air sword road suddenly appeared above the sky. Countless swords fell and attacked the pattern of the Great Law. Finally, A boundless matrix pattern appeared at the end of the ancient sword road. A lady stood at the center of the matrix. She instantly turned into lightning and flashed down toward the lower sky with the sword matrix. Tens of thousands of swords dropped from the ancient sword road, destroying everything. Boom, boom, boom. A series of bomb blasts went off, shaking the sky and the earth. The swords attacked the matrix in a frenzy, causing more and more crevices to appear on the pattern of the Great Law. The void air sword matrix dropped straight down toward Yen Yuan's body. A beam of sword light fell from the sky dome. The sword seemed to be able to break anything. Boom! With a loud noise, the matrix cracked. All the swords fell from the air. Although their power had been weakened by more than half, many of the warriors were still having a hard time defending against them. In the blink of an eye, the imposing lord's residence was reduced to nothing but ashes. The warriors around Li Yao were blown away and scattered to different locations. They wanted to flee, but many shadow-like figures encircled them and launched an attack. They seemed to be the shadow guards of Emperor Xia's realm. The battlefield was disrupted. Many of the warriors were dispersed. On another battlefield, the sword matrix arrived from the void sky and broke the pattern of the Great Law. The giant sword slashed down and kept attacking Yen Yuan. The sword force pierced through his body, leaving blood on Yen Yuan's lips. With a pair of still determined eyes, he looked at the lady dressed in white hovering in the void sky. With the storm of the Great Law surrounding his body, Yen Yuan became the furnace of the Great Law itself, absorbing all the power of the Great Law's 5 elements into his body. He held the giant sword. He wanted to turn into the law. An aura surrounded his body. He had released the power of the deed of thorough comprehension to its ultimate degree. "You should give up," the lady dressed in white said to him. Yen Yuan paused for a second and looked into her eyes. Then Yen Yuan cracked a smile and said, "I told him once that I will show no mercy." After speaking, he joined his hands together and said, as the word emerged, his body turned into the law itself, allowing all the swords to pass through him. At the same time, innumerable sword wills of the Great Law shot into his opponent's matrix. Crevices appeared on the matrix pattern, causing the pattern to explode into pieces. With a loud noise, their bodies were thrown apart. Yen Yuan's clothes were torn and his whole body was tinged with blood. Yaya was hurled into the void sky, eyes still fixed on Yen Yuan. She launched the sword matrix in the void sky. Even though the Dali Imperial Advisor had blocked part of its power, it should have been enough to kill an unblemished plain warrior. However, it was broken by Yen Yuan. She knew that Yen Yuan was severely hurt, but he still bore the attack of her sword matrix. His level was very close to reaching the Nirvana plane. Ji Yuan stepped into the air and tried to leave, but Yen Yuan raised one hand. With the motion of his hand, a gust of sword force pierced through the void sky and blocked his way. Yen Yuan asked, "Where are you going?" Ji Yuan looked at him and asked in return, "Do you still want to fight?" The fight was now 2 against 1. Even though Yen Yuan's ability was extremely strong, he had no advantage against the 2 of them, not to mention that the strike had severely wounded him. Yen Yuan launched the Great Law by force. The pattern again appeared around his body. The magnificent aura around him looked dazzling. Within it, he looked solemn. It was not that he didn't want to quit. He couldn't quit. Nothing could happen to Li Yao. This was for his master. Master's safety was a priority before anything or anyone else. What Master had said that day unnerved him. Ji Yuan looked at the prideful person standing in front of him and sighed. Such an opponent was truly worthy of admiration. Unfortunately, he was still an opponent. The only thing shared between them would be a fight. In another direction, Li Yao had seen the fall of tens of thousands of swords and the many Sage Plain warriors who had been hurt by the sword rain. At this moment, he was being chased by shadow guards of Emperor Xia's realm. He made his way as fast as he could, trying to leave and looking very embarrassed. He had not expected to find himself in such an awkward situation when he was staying in the Li City Lord residence and not even part of the battle. Even under Yen Yuan's protection, he'd still been forced to flee. What a shame! "Your Highness, this way," a voice called from somewhere. Li Yao followed the voice and found that a Sage Plain warrior was waiting there to guide him. His face looked quite familiar to Li Yao. Perhaps this was the third prince's person. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Li Yao walked toward the man waiting for him. The man turned around and led the way. Li Yao walked toward the man waiting for him. The man turned around and led the way. Behind Li Yao, someone was following him and watching closely. They quickly crossed the chaotic battlefield. Suddenly, the man leading the way paused and turned around, saying to Li Yao, "We must hurry up, Your Highness." Wisps of life force flew around his body. His eyes were gorgeous and amazingly deep. At that moment, Li Yao felt like an utter mess. Shame and anger were the only things he could think about. He could not believe that he had been forced to flee. A bolt of lightning flashed across the void sky, directly passing Li Yao to attack the person in front of him. The man paused for a second and looked up. He saw a handsome figure with an extremely thin sword in his hand arriving like a lightning bolt. The sword was like a silver snake, reflecting dazzling light. The sword was being wielded in an extremely fast way. It was like a lightning bolt followed by thunder. The man leading the way squinted his eyes a bit and used his palm to defend himself. The palm print he drew out was immediately torn to pieces. At the same time, his body was pushed back. The sword force swept through him and shredded his robe. He raised his head, confusion in his eyes. He asked the handsome figure who was trying to kill him, "Sir, what did you come here for?" Standing behind them, Li Yao paused to look at the person who was attacking them. It was Dali Imperial Advisor's disciple, Lu Chuan. A peerless figure with intelligence and wisdom who had once launched the Battle of Empty Realm and defeated Emperor Xia's realm. I kept everyone who stayed in the Lord's residence in mind. Even the people who went to Thousand Leaves City, I know the life force of every one of them. You look like one of the third prince's subordinates, but you are not him, said Lu Chuan softly. Brother Seventh Swordsman, long time no see. This name, Seventh Swordsman, was like a thunderbolt out of the blue that exploded in Li Yao's brain. He suddenly raised his head and fiercely looked at the person in front of him. With his eyes widened, he fixed his stare on him, his face turning pale gray. He couldn't be more familiar with the name. He had sworn to kill this person no matter what. Yet he'd been duped again. A gust of violent force swept out from Li Yao's body. He was angry like a furious dragon, but there was a sort of fear in his anger. The Seventh Swordsman had almost damaged him. Before, when Yen Yuan had stood in front of him, he'd been completely confident that Yen Yuan could defend against anyone below the Nirvana plane. Li Yao completely trusted Dali Imperial Advisor's disciples. Yen Yuan was capable indeed. Even though he was severely wounded, he had still successfully blocked two top figures of Emperor Xia's realm and allowed him to escape. At this moment, it was another of Dali Imperial Advisor's disciples, Lu Chuan, who was standing in front of him. His talent was also extraordinary. However, Li Yao lost his confidence. His opponent was Yi Futian. Even though Yi Futian was the man he hated most and wanted to kill, from the bottom of Li Yao's heart, he still totally acknowledged Yi Futian's ability. This place was weirdly quiet while the rest of the battlefield was in turmoil. As a wind passed by, the robe of the person standing there blew in the wind. His long hair had turned silver since he'd last seen him. The contour of his face had changed too. Soon, the handsome face became clear to Li Yao's eyes. He clenched his fists. His face was extremely sullen. Yi Futian, he spat out the name like venom. Yi Futian didn't look at Li Yao, ignoring him. He fixed his eyes on Lu Chuan and asked, "Brother, could you just let me through?" "No, I can't," replied Lu Chuan. He initiated his cultivation method. Suddenly, the will emanated between the sky and earth, tearing the void apart. A storm of will appeared in the space that was trying to shatter the area. Lu Chuan's body was surrounded by the horrifying sword will. "Sorry for the offense," said Yi Futian. A long halberd appeared in his hand. The halberd of time and space swallowed and spat out the terrifying space will which swept through the void air, trying to seal and freeze it. The great law enveloped the sky and earth. Li Yao and Lu Chuan felt like they were submerged in the absolute space. At this moment, Lu Chuan flicked his wrist, and the silver sword light swept over the sky and crushed the space will. The two powers were colliding with each other in an invisible form. Bam! Yi Futian stepped forward and released the dense space will which shook the void sky, almost stiffening it. Lu Chuan looked solemn. The silver storm grew even stronger, growing to cover all the skies. Bam! One more step. Yi Futian kept heading forward. The void air trembled again. He merged the footwork of Shenyuan into the will, and his might became even more powerful. As he took his third step, Yi Futian disappeared where he stood. His body transformed into many shadows that then reappeared in front of Lu Chuan. Innumerable shadows of giant halberds appeared between the sky and earth and then converged into one. One halberd pierced through the void sky. Extreme shadow, the halberd of nothingness. The long silver sword in Lu Chuan's hand started to move. All of a sudden, the sky and earth started humming. The sword struck, chopping the light and splitting the shadow, tearing the void sky apart and sending out infinite silver sparks. The moment their attacks collided, storms of destruction rose between the sky and earth. With a deep boom, Yi Futian stomped on the ground and started moving like a phantom. He drove the halberd forward with another thrust. Annihilation came with the second strike. The will of the great law shattered the void sky and crazily smashed the silver sword will, surging toward Lu Chuan's body. Lu Chuan's finger tapped on the sword. The sword force between the sky and earth was dazzling. An impressive glow fell upon the sword as the will of the great law merged into the one sword. The sword came out. The void sky cracked. One sword was left. An extremely dazzling beam of light appeared between them. The hefty attacking power was chopped in half by the sword. Above Lu Chuan's body, the deed of thorough comprehension bloomed. The holy aura enveloped his body. The great law dropped down, and his body was surrounded by the sword will, becoming transparent, as if he was the sword itself. At the same time, similar power was released from Yi Futian's body. The glow of the deed of thorough comprehension was also sacred. The great law became one, and all the wills turned into the path of the space. The sky and earth were being shackled. Numerous sword wills appeared from the void and attacked Lu Chuan. Lu Chuan's body didn't move. He still stood firmly on his feet. When the sword swung toward his body, it couldn't break his sword defense. Bam! Yi Futian started walking again. The sky and earth became heavy. He kept walking forward. Lu Chuan looked even more solemn. His body seemed to be bearing the extremely heavy pressure of the great law. "Brother, watch out," said Yi Futian. He took one more step after he spoke, his body then bending forward. He released the halberd of time and space. The storm of destruction tore the void sky apart and marched ahead, as if anything in front of him would be destroyed. The third strike, unending void. The great law returned to the unending void. Everything was annihilated. The sword in Lu Chuan's hand was hanging before his chest. He drew two palm prints. The sword will of the great law flew from the sky and earth into the sword. The sword swallowed and spat silver light tens of thousands of feet into the air. All the sword shadows became one and blended into the sword. The sword made a series of metallic clangs. Crevices appeared in the space as if the sky and earth were about to be torn apart. A pattern of the great law appeared in the void sky with the sword as its axis. In the pattern of the great law, all swords turned into one and merged into the sword. Finally, Lu Chuan extended his palm forward. When the sword came out, the sky and earth roared for it. In front of him, the halberd of time and space that Yi Futian held in his hands stabbed at the sword. The halberd of time and space collided with the sword. The storm of destruction collided with the sky. The horrifying explosion of storms swept out as the sword swept back. The violent will beat against Lu Chuan's body. He spat out blood and was blown away. Zoom. A lightning bolt flashed across the sky. The halberd of time and space aimed at Lu Chuan's chest but didn't stab him. Lu Chuan raised his head and looked at the figure in front of him, sighing to himself. He and Yen Yuan had been cautious enough to arrange the plan, but had they still lost? "Please forgive me, brother," said Yi Futian. Yi Futian walked past him and headed after Li Yao. Lu Chuan didn't give chase. Yi Futian had just shown mercy to him. Otherwise, he would have been killed. It was meaningless to chase him again. Why had he been born in Emperor Xia's realm? On the battlefield of the Lord's residence, Yan Yuan was defending against two top figures of the unblemished plain. Of course, he had perceived Yi Futian's presence. He stepped into the sky. His matrix of the Great Law covered the sky, trying to block Yaya and Ji Yuan. He wanted to leave the battlefield to help Li Yao. However, tens of thousands of swords had fallen and sealed the sky and earth. There was no way Yaya would let him leave the battlefield. Yi Futian was traveling through the void sky and rapidly heading toward Li Yao. Li Yao had entered the Saint Plain, but he even had no courage to fight when confronted by Yi Futian. He believed that he could never defeat Yi Futian. That was why he wanted to escape. Kill him. Li Yao gave the order to a warrior who was fighting with a shadow guard. The warrior was a saint of true self with extraordinary ability. After he repelled a shadow guard of the same level, he turned to Yi Futian, guarding Li Yao who was still trying to flee. Yi Futian stepped into the void sky and pointed one finger in front of him. He summoned the sword of Cassiopeia, tore the void air apart. The warrior flew into the void sky and did a double palm strike. Suddenly, tens of thousands of palm prints appeared and shattered the sword of Cassiopeia into pieces. However, Yi Futian kept moving forward. More and more swords came to attack. Cruelty flashed across his eyes. No matter how talented the person was, he was only on the first level of the Saint Plain. Why did he dare to come near? The seemingly infinite swords were all destroyed. The guards smashed the palm at Yi Futian. At this moment, a strong presage of destruction befell him. Among all of the swords, one emanated with such a horrifying life force that he could perceive the fatal crisis approaching him. The sword seemed to have emerged from the center of Yi Futian's eyebrows. It pierced through his palm print with incredible speed. He let out a roar. Soon, a powerful will rose in front of him to guard him. This was the will of the Great Law. The sword thrust toward it. An extremely dazzling light spat out from the sword. His pupils contracted. What he could see in his mind was an inviolable sword with a wisp of the will of the Emperor. The sword had been forged by the master of Divine Cloud Valley at Yi Futian's request, so the wisp of his will of the Emperor had been merged with it. The sword flashed by and penetrated the warrior's skull. Yi Futian didn't stop there. He strode over the corpse as he continued walking forward. Li Yao perceived the scene with so much fear in his eyes. How had Yi Futian cultivated his sword force to be this strong? He could kill a saint of true self with just one strike. Li Yao's heart beat fast. He could feel the life force behind him coming near. He was in such despair. When he had come to the lower world 9 states of Emperor Xia's realm, he had never expected that such a day like this would come. At that time, he had been the prince of the upper world, the descendant of Emperor Li. His identity was truly noble, especially to the people of lower worlds. To him, the people of the lower world's 9 states were nothing but loathsome ants, not worth taking into consideration. Even though he'd let Saint Ji kill his wife, Li Yao didn't care much at all. However, today, the person he'd once regarded as another ant of the lower worlds was trying to kill the Dali prince. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Li Yao was still running forward when he saw swords raining down from above, cutting his escape route right then and there. Li Yao was still running forward when he saw swords raining down from above, cutting his escape route right then and there. Vast pressure swept all over, and Li Yao turned around abruptly, throwing out his hand toward Yi Futian, who was charging at him. His arm was transformed into an extremely saintly 5-clawed dragon that charged abruptly at Yi Futian. It was apparent that Li Yao did not want to roll over and die. He too was a saint. While his powers were inferior to those of Yi Futian, he deemed it necessary to fight, nonetheless. However, his face appeared rather twisted at that moment, displaying an expression of anger amid despair. That look in his eyes suggested that he wanted to battle Yi Futian. The halberd of time and space was thrust out like a bolt of lightning. Rumbling noises were heard as the huge, 5-clawed, golden dragon exploded and crumbled. Yi Futian did not stop charging. He continued streaking through the air and appeared right before Li Yao. The place seemed to have frozen when the halberd struck. Li Yao roared in anger, and the space around them trembled. He stepped forward as an extremely dazzling specter appeared above him. It did not seem to be something of his own will. Rather, it seemed to be an imposing renhuang shooting right out of his brain. Yi Futian sensed looming danger ahead. The raging will lashed out right away. He had sensed the imposing renhuang's shadow. While it was a construct of spiritual willpower, the hurricane of rage still sent him flying. That spiritual willpower then charged right into his mind. That will was incredibly grand and imposing. It was a true will of renhuang, wiping out the existence of all other wills. Boom! Yi Futian suffered a huge blow to his mind, and his body was sent flying again and crashed to the ground. Blood spilled from his mouth, and he felt rather hazy. Li Yao's expression was extremely gloomy as he looked at Yi Futian. The will that his father left within him enabled him to invoke this power when he was in mortal peril. It was known simply as the will of renhuang. He had little idea how powerful it would be, but upon seeing the scene before him, Li Yao no longer despaired and seemed to find the light of hope. His eyes were filled with a negative, violent aura as he headed towards Yi Futian. Dead. If his father's will had crushed Yi Futian's will, it would have been possible for him to kill Yi Futian on the spot. Seeing Yi Futian on the ground not budging even an inch, Li Yao's face became ferocious with a cruel smirk in his eyes. He had always wanted to kill Yi Futian, the ant from the 9 states of the lower worlds who had been growing into an increasingly greater threat to him. So he's dead now, eh? And to die in such a way, how dramatic indeed. Raging aura was unleashed from his body as he extended his hand. A terrifying, 5-clawed, golden dragon appeared right above Yi Futian's head. While Yi Futian remained slumped where he was, Li Yao nonetheless wanted to kill him one more time. Die! Li Yao roared, and the 5-clawed, golden dragon came down blasting Yi Futian's body. The ground exploded and dust flew everywhere. Li Yao walked up, taking one step at a time and finally smiled, which made him look rather crazy. However, that simply lasted for an instant. His smile froze as a figure rose from the flying dust around them. Jade-green light emanated from Yi Futian's body. It was a manifestation of the power of life, and it was tremendously thick. He opened his eyes, and they looked deep like a bottomless abyss. It left Li Yao, who had been smiling, with a gaping jaw. Li Yao then saw Yi Futian stand up. How could he possibly survive? There was blood at the corner of Yi Futian's mouth, and he looked rather pale. The will of renhuang had almost killed him. If it had not been for the imperial will protecting him, he would already be dead. Li Yao was not the most highly regarded of Emperor Li's offspring and was the weakest among his siblings in training. However, he, nonetheless, had protection provided by Emperor Li. Pathetic. That was the word that Yi Futian uttered plainly as he looked at Li Yao's ferocious-looking eyes. Thunderous light of the Great Path seemed to be glimmering on his body. It was a manifestation of the Great Path, basking in the light of calamity. When he became a saint, the resilience of his constitution made his body a true body of a saint. Saintly attacks of the same level were hardly capable of doing any harm to his body. Pathetic. Li Yao felt a chill all over as he heard Yi Futian's sarcastic jab at him. He was a prince of the Dali dynasty, and Yi Futian called him pathetic. Pathetic, eh? Indeed I am. The way that Yi Futian looked at him now was just like the way he had looked at Yi Futian before striking him down. Boom! Light of calamity bombarded Li Yao's body like a thunderous disaster of the Great Path. His soul trembled as his body was paralyzed. However, he did not run away. He would not be able to escape this person even if he wanted to. He was indeed pathetic. The only thing that seemed to be waiting for him was death. A shout came from afar, and Yi Futian turned his head to look in that direction. Yen Yuan was conjuring diagrams of the Great Path and had blood all over his body. Yaya and Ji Yuan attacked at the same time, and there was no way that Yen Yuan, who had been severely injured before, could have resisted their attack. Yaya had once been a holiness of nirvana. Yen Yuan turned around at that moment and looked at Yi Futian, whose eyes seemed rather dull. Sword wills whooshed around Yi Futian, and the sword of Cassiopeia penetrated Li Yao's body in an instant. Blood spilled all over him and sword wills raged throughout his body. Blood was still spilling from his mouth, and he struggled to stand. However, he did not die. He looked up at Yi Futian and said, "Give me a quick one." He thought that Yi Futian was about to torture him and make things hellish for him while he was still alive. Boom! A hand clapped down and lifted Li Yao. Yi Futian's eyes reddened from the incredible intent to kill he felt. "I wanted to give you a quick one as well." Yi Futian's voice croaked as if he was struggling to speak. Li Yao had killed Yi Futian's wife back in the empty realm, and he had almost killed Yi Futian's kin as well. There was no way that Yi Futian did not hate Li Yao. He wanted nothing more than to see Li Yao's heart pierced by thousands of swords. However, when he saw the determination in Yen Yuan's eyes and the implications of the fight between the 8 holinesses of Nirvana, he refrained from dealing the killing blow. If Li Yao died, it would be extremely possible that a war would break out between the Dali dynasty and Emperor Xia's realm. Then Yi Futian questioned if he would be able to shoulder the responsibility of a war breaking out between those 2 imperial realms. He questioned his right to do so. That was why he was struggling. Boom! A hand lifted Li Yao's body and Yi Futian walked away, heading to the other battlefield. Lu Chuan, who saw Yi Futian still grabbing Li Yao from afar, chased after him. Many who had been fighting around them stopped. The space quieted down again. Yi Futian headed straight for the battlefield where Yen Yuan was and called, "Yaya." Yaya and the others turned around when they heard his voice. The swords were rescinded, and she came to Yi Futian's side. Ji Yuan stopped fighting as well. Yen Yuan then looked at Yi Futian. Despite being covered in blood, he still looked resilient, standing tall and proud. A smile suddenly appeared on his face, but a sad one. "I didn't think we would actually lose to you," Yen Yuan said. His expression was an extremely complicated one, filled with emotions that he was unable to place. He did not resent Yi Futian, although they were on opposing sides. Naturally, he still admired Yi Futian. That day when they had parted at the 9 states, those words had come true. Yen Yuan knew that he had prepared for this battle, yet Yi Futian still ended up taking down Li Yao. "There are no winners or losers here," Yi Futian sighed and continued, "Let's head to Qinya City." Yaya waved her hands about and then a sword appeared in the air. Several of them stepped onto it, and the sword streaked away. Lu Chuan walked to Yen Yuan's side, and Yen Yuan then mumbled, "No wonder our teacher liked him so much." "He might not kill the prince, brother," Lu Chuan said. Yen Yuan turned to look at him as he continued, "He was here to avenge his wife. If he was going to cut down the prince, he would have done it already." Yen Yuan looked at Yi Futian disappearing in the distance and said, "Let's go." He then stepped forward. Lu Chuan stood at Yen Yuan's side and looked at his eldest brother while sighing deeply. Li Yao was lost in his eldest brother's hands. If Yi Futian were to kill Li Yao, blame would first fall onto Yen Yuan's shoulders. However, Lu Chuan thought at the moment that his eldest brother was, instead, more concerned for their teacher. The battle was still raging in Qinya City, and the place looked like a mess. The mighty ones were fighting close to each other. The sword master of Lihen had injured Chao Kong before, yet Chao Kong's demonic powers were overwhelming. He was extremely resilient, refusing to back away. He went all the way to the battlefield where the imperial advisor of Dali and the great shaman were fighting. The prince regent managed to fight off Lu Yu and pushed the battle all the way to the central region of Qinya City. The 6 figures at the holiness of Nirvana level were fighting earth-shattering battles high in the air. Many throughout Qinya City looked up at the battles, their hearts racing. Many saints perished on that battlefield. The imperial advisor had no intention of fighting any longer when Yaya, who had returned, opened the ancient path of the sword with a single stroke, then headed far away. She definitely had gone to Li City. The imperial advisor had no idea how Yen Yuan would have fared and if his student would have been able to block her attack. "Li Yao has been taken. Stop fighting immediately," a voice came from nowhere. The mighty ones who had been fighting were, at first, dumbfounded and then turned to see who had spoken. It was none other than a demonic beast. "My master has taken Li Yao and is heading back here," the Black Wind Condor continued saying. The imperial advisor shouted, and, throughout the battlefield, countless soldiers felt their brains rattling. There were mighty ones throughout the vast battlefield, but they were unable to help and backed away from each other. That shout had made them all cease fighting. The imperial advisor scanned the battlefield. He had not wanted to see a fight happen, but he had no choice. So Yi Futian has taken Li Yao, eh? Yan Yuan had been there to guard him. I wonder how he is doing now. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. The battlefield of Chinya City was littered with ruins, and that happened with the mighty ones fighting in the air and not causing any collateral damage from above. The battlefield of Chinya City was littered with ruins, and that happened with the mighty ones fighting in the air and not causing any collateral damage from above. Half of the city would have been razed otherwise. The atmosphere was extraordinarily tense at that moment. They all had ceased fighting, but everyone was still in a ready-to-strike position as if the fighting could restart at any moment. In truth, both sides had things under control to a certain measure as the mighty ones all went out of their way to find opponents of comparable strength. If fighters from the Dali dynasty who were at the holiness of nirvana level were to kill those on the lower levels of Emperor Xia's realm, there would hardly be anyone left. Both sides were not willing to pay that price. As such, all went out of their way to keep the battle contained instead of trying to annihilate each other. However, Li Yao, a prince of the Dali dynasty, was taken. Everyone indeed wondered what the outcome would be. No one had an answer, and everyone was waiting. Imperial advisor, could any cultivators of Emperor Xia's realm stop you? The Prince Regent asked as he looked at the imperial advisor. His words puzzled many. What is the Prince Regent of the Dali dynasty getting at? Is he chastising the imperial advisor for not doing his best? Are there conflicts within the Dali dynasty itself? However, Dali's imperial advisor had been extremely forceful in the battle, so much that he looked invincible. If he were to go all out, there was no telling how many would have perished. The imperial advisor shot a look at the Prince Regent and said, "You were not able to stop them yourself either, Prince Regent." The Prince Regent's expression turned cold. "I hope that His Highness is doing fine. Yan Yuan is your topmost student, #1 in Dali below the holiness of nirvana level. If he is around, I believe that the animal is simply bluffing. How could His Highness be taken with Yan Yuan around?" The imperial advisor frowned and shot a cold look at the Prince Regent. The Prince Regent saw that Yaya had opened up the ancient path of the sword and zipped off. He could tell just how frighteningly powerful the might of her sword was. It seemed as if she had surpassed the level of the unblemished saint. Yan Yuan was known to be at the pinnacle of the unblemished saint level, but that sword would have been dangerous nonetheless. However, not only did the Prince Regent ignore the fact that Yan Yuan could have been in danger, but he claimed that Li Yao could not possibly have been taken when Yan Yuan was around. His scheme was obvious. The imperial advisor did not bother arguing with the Prince Regent about anything. A sword will from afar zipped past, finally, and everyone looked up and saw the group of figures heading their way. Everyone's face changed when they saw what had happened, especially those from the Dali dynasty. The 9th prince of the Dali dynasty, Li Yao, had been taken. Yi Futian, Yaya, and the others had Li Yao tagging along as their prisoner. Yi Futian turned to look at the battlefield and, in a flash, headed straight to the crowd and stopped in front of Emperor Xia's realm. Yan Yuan followed suit and looked up at the imperial advisor. Regret was in his eyes as he said, "I failed, teacher." The imperial advisor took a look at Yan Yuan's blood-stained body and sighed deep down, saying, "It's fine that you come back in one piece." Yan Yuan, a cold voice was heard. It was the Prince Regent who was visibly angered, saying, "So this is what you call protecting His Highness?" Yan Yuan took one look at the Prince Regent and said, "I have indeed failed." The Prince Regent's eyes were cold. He then looked down at Yi Futian and Li Yao. Dragon roars were heard as he took a step forward. A mighty voice filled the air. "Let him go." One figure after another stood before Yi Futian and cast their gaze at the Prince Regent. Yi Futian looked up at the Prince Regent who was high in the sky. Li Yao had been severely injured. A A spark of hope ignited in his mind at the moment. There was still a chance of him emerging alive. Since Yi Futian had yet to kill him, it meant that there were still ways of turning things around. Both the imperial advisor and the prince regent were there. He did not think for a second that Yi Futian would have dared to kill him in front of them. You people from Dali were the ones who waged war on us by sending people to invade Qinya City. Li Yao had attempted to kill me several times. What do you make of that? Yi Futian said as he looked at the prince regent. If you dare to make a move against His Highness, I swear that you shall never leave this place, the prince regent said with an imposing voice, paying no heed to Yi Futian's words. A sword will zipped past and a sword of Cassiopeia streaked out right in front of Yi Futian, hanging right at Li Yao's throat. In an instant, blood was dripping from Li Yao's throat. You're going too far, the prince regent roared. Put any pressure on him from here on out, and Li Yao dies, Yi Futian said as he looked coldly at the prince regent. The prince regent's eyes filled with imposing anger, but then he heard Yi Futian continue, if he dies, it's on you. I dare you to try. The prince regent's expression turned extremely glum, and he rescinded the aura emanating from him. Yi Futian was intentionally making it difficult for him. He was unable to shoulder such a crime. Yi Futian looked at those around him and said, I will let him go, as long as the people of Dali leave the Crimson Dragon realm and never step into it again. I shall release him. He had made this decision despite the struggle he felt deep down. However, he eventually decided to spare Li Yao. It was far more difficult to spare someone than to kill them. He was able to take Li Yao that day and had a chance of killing him. He would still have the chance to do so in the future. At present, however, he needed to consider the consequences of killing Li Yao and who would have been caught in the crossfire. As such, he came to that decision. It was a very difficult one for him to make, but he made it, nonetheless. Both the imperial advisor of Dali and Yen Yuan had been able to escort him out. There was no reason he couldn't do the same. He was considering it for the imperial advisor and his brother in training, Yen Yuan. Saints and sages do not thank someone for saving them and then resent them for not doing more. The imperial advisor had brought his people to take Yi Futian, but Yi Futian knew that the imperial advisor, Yen Yuan, and the others had been reluctant to do so. As such, he did not mind at all. Even though they might end up meeting each other on future battlefields as enemies, he still did not regret what he did. If we were to leave, who is to say that you would actually let the prince go? Asked Li Zhen, the third prince, as he stared at Yi Futian. He did not expect Li Yao to end up as a prisoner. If things had turned out that way, it would have been difficult for the battle to go on, especially when Yi Futian had yet to kill Li Yao. If he were to kill Li Yao, then the real fight would have truly broken out. Both sides would no longer hold back against each other after that. I believe him, Your Highness, said a voice, and Li Zhen looked to see whose it was. It was the imperial advisor of Dali. He looked at Li Zhen and said, Your Highness, this all happened because of me. I shall serve as the guarantor and stay behind to take the prince home. Li Zhen looked at the imperial advisor, and Yi Futian said, That is acceptable. There were other things that he wanted to say to the imperial advisor as well. The place was silent and many looked at Li Zhen. Li Yao turned his eyes toward his third brother. It seemed that Yi Futian did not dare to kill him, after all. That settles it. Li Zhen's expression was extremely cold, but there was little else he could have done. He was extremely reluctant to do that, but there was no way he could have just let Yi Futian kill Li Yao. Imperial advisor, I shall leave my ninth brother to you, Li Zhen then said to the imperial advisor. He then waved his hand and said, Retreat. He then gathered his people and left. The prince regent's expression was ice cold as he glanced at Yi Futian, but he was unable to do anything else other than leave. So Yi Futian was calm and planned to let Li Yao go. What Yi Futian did ground the battle to a halt. If nothing was going to happen to Li Yao and the imperial advisor was to take him away, then there was nothing he could have done to the imperial advisor. There would have been no excuse to spark a war. As such, everything he had done had gone to waste. It also meant that the trip to the Crimson Dragon realm would be a waste. One figure after another left. The people from the Dali dynasty retreated like a tide. Those from Emperor Xia's realm who were still on the battlefield rescinded their aura and looked at Yi Futian. When everyone from Dali left, there was only the imperial advisor, Yen Yuan, and some others remaining. Yi Futian looked at the silhouette that was far away in the sky, and he stepped forward, heading in the imperial advisor's direction. Yaya followed right behind him. While Yi Futian was confident that the imperial advisor would not have harmed him, Yaya followed nonetheless. As for Li Yao, no way could he run with so many mighty ones from Emperor Xia's realm around. "Teacher," Yi Futian called as he came before the imperial advisor of Dali and bowed. The imperial advisor looked at the handsome young man before him and sighed. He truly wanted to take Yi Futian as his student. "Let's just leave Dali," Yi Futian said to the imperial advisor telepathically. He was able to tell from the Prince Regent's attitude that his teacher was, at present, having a hard time in Dali. The imperial advisor sighed and shook his head slightly. Some things were not as simple as Yi Futian thought they could be. There was no way the imperial advisor could have simply left. Ren Huang from foreign realms are unable to interfere with anything going on in the Crimson Dragon realm. "You don't have to be a traitor, teacher," Yi Futian advised him telepathically again. His teacher could have learned a lesson from the ninth servant of the ancient imperial city setting up shop in the Crimson Dragon realm. If he had not sided with the enemy, Emperor Xia's realm, then he would not have been considered a traitor. He only needed to resign from his post as the imperial advisor. "I'll think about it," the imperial advisor said. If things were to turn out okay, he would try to leave, although he knew that success was near impossible. "Take care, teacher," said Yi Futian, and he bowed. He then turned around and looked in Li Yao's direction and said, "Let him go." Ji Yuan and the others intended to let him go, but someone came to Li Yao's side at the moment, looked at Yi Futian and said, "Yi Futian, Li Yao has been trying to murder time and again to start a war between the realms. Now that you have taken him, you can't just let him go like that." Yi Futian was dumbfounded. He then turned to see who spoke. It was none other than the eldest prince of Emperor Xia's realm, Xia Rong. "Your Highness," Yi Futian wanted to say something. "Yi Futian, you're too soft. There is no way you could achieve big things like that," Xia Rong said and then grabbed Li Yao's throat. His overwhelming aura flowed from him, and he sensed the intention to kill him. The scene shocked everyone. Even those from Emperor Xia's realm looked at Xia Rong. Yi Futian had been the one in charge of everything before Xia Rong showed up, so much so that even Xia Qingyun just let him be. However, with the eldest prince, Xia Rong, showing up, everyone wondered who was in charge. Yi Futian agreed to let him go, but Xia Rong did not. There have been many saints who died fighting in the Crimson Dragon realm. The Sword Master and the others come here personally. If Dali is not afraid to wage war, then there is nothing the Emperor Xia's realm should be afraid of. Xia Rong looked at Yi Futian and said, "Remember, Yi Futian, those who do big things need to be decisive." Xia Rong pressed hard with his hand as soon as he was done speaking. Li Yao was thoroughly frightened and found it difficult to breathe. A crisp crack was heard, causing everyone's hearts to skip a beat. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. The vast space quieted down within moments. The vast space quieted down within moments. Countless eyes watched Li Yao, who was being held in Xia Rong's hand. He then let go, and Li Yao dropped to the ground. The dead man's eyes were still opened. Xia Rong had invaded Li Yao's mind with the will of the Great Path and killed him in an instant. His action had been decisive and without a hint of hesitation. Li Yao, the ninth prince of the Dali dynasty, perished. He died in the Crimson Dragon realm at the hands of Xia Rong. Yi Futian looked with astonishment at what transpired. He then turned his eyes to Xia Rong, whose face was filled with coldness and determination. It seemed that his will was adamant and undeniable. It was as if he had long made up his mind. "Brother," Xia Qingyun had watched the scene unfold with the same level of astonishment. Her mind was blank as well. They were not the only ones astonished. Everyone from Emperor Xia's realm that was present shared the sentiment. Many thoughts ran through their minds in that instant, and their hearts raced. Even the swordmaster of Lihan took a good look at Xia Rong. That move had indeed been brutal and merciless. He killed Li Yao and robbed everyone else of any other options. Yi Futian had just promised to let go of Li Yao, and his people went back on his word. He was thinking of how to deal with the imperial advisor, now that Li Yao was dead. Furthermore, the imperial advisor had spoken in Yi Futian's favor in front of all the mighty ones of Dali, guaranteeing the prince's safety. However, there was no way he could go back to Emperor Li unscathed now that Li Yao was dead. The imperial advisor, Yan Yuan, and Mu Chunyang were baffled by what transpired in front of their eyes. All of it seemed to have happened too suddenly. They had understood that Yi Futian had been ready to let go of the prince instead of killing him. However, Xia Rong made his move. The faces of Yan Yuan and the others turned pale. Everything seemed to have happened as their teacher had predicted. Powerful sword will emanated from Yaya, who was standing in the air behind Yi Futian. The light of sword was brought to its limit on her. She took Yi Futian's hand, intending to retreat with him. However, Yi Futian did not move, he stayed put in the air. He understood what Yaya was trying to do. The imperial advisor was a guarantor for Dali after all. The imperial advisor needed to first kill the man before his eyes before going back to Emperor Li. Both men were an arm's length away from each other, so it would be easy for him to kill Yi Futian, just as easy as it was for Xia Rong to kill Li Yao. Yi Futian knew that without doubt. He was even very clear that if the imperial advisor insisted on killing him, Yaya would not be able to keep him safe. There would be no chance of him surviving at this distance. To fulfill his duty to Emperor Li, the imperial advisor needed to kill him. It had to be done. If he refused, it would be tantamount to treason. Xia Rong had cut off the imperial advisor's escape route. His standpoint was that the imperial advisor had done nothing wrong. He posed an immense threat to Emperor Xiao's realm, after all. The imperial advisor had stepped up to guarantee Li Yao's safety, but now one was imagining what was going through Emperor Li's mind now that Li Yao was dead. That move had been too brutal. Yi Futian felt a chill running throughout his body. So this is the eldest prince of Emperor Xiao's realm who had been training since he was young and grew up in battles of life and death? He really is brutal. It was just like he put it, decisive and without mercy. Yi Futian might have ended up dead because of what he did. Yet he showed no hint of mercy at all. He looked at Li Yao, who was already dead. He had been wanting to kill Li Yao for years, but not at a time like this. Especially when the imperial advisors served to guarantee the prince's safety. Go back, Yaya, Yi Futian said with a light tone. Yaya looked at him with stubborn eyes. She added strength to her hand, intending to take him away. Yi Futian shook his head at her, and Yaya finally gave in. She turned around and looked at the imperial advisor and said, "He had nothing to do with this." Yi Futian looked at the imperial advisor with regret written all over his face. He understood that his teacher had stepped up to act as the guarantor out of trust for him. However, it was because of him that his teacher was caught in such a predicament. He lowered his head and felt speechless. Regardless of your choice, teacher, I have nothing to say against it. Yi Futian then sighed. He would not have held a grudge against the imperial advisor even if he wanted to kill him on the spot. After all, he was the one who started it. The imperial advisor turned around and looked at the handsome face before him, sighing deeply. He, of course, knew that Yi Futian had nothing to do with the prince's death, but that didn't matter. He vouched for Yi Futian and volunteered to act as a guarantor, yet His Majesty's son died right before his eyes regardless. Who else would have been able to shoulder such a crime? Since he was the guarantor, there was no doubt that it would be him. There was only one thing left for him to do, fight to the death. Kill Yi Futian, kill Xia Rong, bring their heads to Emperor Li, and wage a war between realms. That was the only way for him to make amends. He was the only holiness of nirvana from Dali present, while the enemy had 4. Xia Rong was an unblemished saint, which meant that there was no guarantee that the imperial advisor would have been able to kill him. Yi Futian, on the other hand, he could simply clap him to death right there and then. But should I kill him? Yan Yuan's eyes were bloodshot. He looked at the two silhouettes looking at each other in the sky. Yi Futian had chosen to spare Li Yao's life. He was able to see Yi Futian's breadth of character from there. But then again, how would a teacher deal with such a predicament, and what choices would he have? His teacher, notwithstanding, felt the struggle deep in his mind. It was simply too painful to go with either option. The key, however, was that there were really no options to begin with. Betray Dali? Fei Xue is still at Dali. Furthermore, if Fei Xue is indeed around, would she be willing to let the teacher kill Yi Futian? She would probably suffer a pain worse than death. Imperial Advisor. Another voice was heard at that moment. Everyone turned to see Xia Qingyuan speaking. Xia Qingyuan stood where she was and looked up in the air. Her eyes, focused on the Imperial Advisor, looked adamant and determined. It is indeed our fault that my brother has caused you to break your promise. However, this has nothing to do with Yi Futian. If you were to kill him, regardless of whatever else that happened, I would be forced to pay whatever price I have to pay to keep you and your students around. Xia Qingyuan's voice had a murderous tinge to it. It was determined and undeniable. She, at that moment, sounded just like Xia Rong. Xia Rong was the eldest prince. She, on the other hand, was the most doted on of Emperor Xia's daughters, a fact known by all. Xia Rong looked at his little sister and sighed deeply. That was how it was when one lets sentiments do the talking. Why not choose to side with Emperor Xia's realm, Imperial Advisor? I'm willing to guarantee that your place in Emperor Xia's realm would definitely not be worse than your place in Emperor Li's realm. Xia Rong said, furthermore, Emperor Li is irritated by you now. Judging by the words of the Prince Regent, I'm sure you know what is going on, Imperial Advisor. Yi Futian turned and cast a cold glance at Xia Rong. You're telling him to betray his emperor? He knew how much the Imperial Advisor cherished Fei Xue. His fatherly love for her was as great as the mountains. Honor and duty aside, Fei Xue was still in Dali, so there was no way for the Imperial Advisor to betray his emperor. Yi Futian had been advising the Imperial Advisor in secret to have him consider moving to the Crimson Dragon realm. Xia Rong had, instead, cut off any escape for the Imperial Advisor. What he did was tantamount to pushing the Imperial Advisor off of a ledge. If anything were to happen to the Imperial Advisor, Dali would lose a combatant at the pinnacle of his powers. If a war between realms were to break out, Emperor Xia's realm had something to gain as well. Furthermore, the Imperial Advisor's status in Emperor Li's realm was such that, if anything were to happen to him, news would quickly spread and cause a massive ripple. At the very least, the power of the Imperial Advisor's residence would be dismantled right away. All eyes looked at the Imperial Advisor high in the air. Everyone was waiting for his decision. The Imperial Advisor appeared very calm at the moment. Wind blew and his robe billowed. Neither Xia Qingyuan's determined threat nor Xia Rong's persuasion moved him. He was still as calm as he had always been. He looked at the young man before him and eventually sighed. This is fate, I guess. He had been able to foretell all of this before he came. But he was still unable to run from any of it, and unable to run, he saw fit to take things as they came instead. Yi Futian, the Imperial Advisor called. His voice was calm and gentle, without the slightest hint of being fettered. I'm here. Yi Futian lowered his head slightly and answered. I'd like to share 2 lines with you before we part, the Imperial Advisor continued. That indicated that he had made his decision. Yi Futian looked up at the Imperial Advisor and wondered, is he getting ready to shoulder everything on his own? His eyes reddened somewhat as if sand had gotten into them. A wise man does not stand beneath a collapsing wall, the Imperial Advisor said. That was the first line he shared with Yi Futian. The young man knew that his teacher was talking about their current predicament. Yi Futian was, at the moment, putting himself beneath a collapsing wall. If the Imperial Advisor were to attempt to kill him, there was no chance he'd survive. His previous action of infiltrating Dali as the 7th swordsman was in the same vein. He was putting himself beneath a collapsing wall. The Imperial Advisor then turned around and walked, telling Yen Yuan and the others, let's go. Yen Yuan looked at his teacher and then at Yi Futian. His steps were heavy, but since his teacher had made the decision, all of them moved nonetheless and followed their teacher. What is the second line? Yi Futian then called, looking at his teacher's back. As heaven's movement is ever vigorous, so must a wise man ceaselessly strive, the imperial advisor said loudly to Yi Futian with his back to him. The brimming voice was imbued with a virtuous aura. Yi Futian's eyes turned even redder. He clenched his fist tightly as he looked at the silhouette that was gradually disappearing from his sight. As heaven's movement is ever vigorous, so must a wise man ceaselessly strive. The next line to that would have been, as the earth's condition is receptive devotion, a wise man shall develop an all-encompassing breadth of character. You are of a breadth of character that is all-encompassing, teacher. Yet why do you put yourself under a collapsing wall? Yi Futian yelled at the figure who was disappearing. His teacher had spared him, which meant that his teacher would now be in more serious trouble. One of Emperor Li's sons perished, and the imperial advisor had the opportunity to kill the one who caused his death. Sparing the killer will come with severe implications. The mighty ones from Emperor Xia's realm looked at the imperial advisor's disappearing silhouette, and they felt pity for him. While those present were on opposing sides, and it was the first time many met him, they nonetheless developed respect for him from the bottom of their hearts. So, this is the imperial advisor of Dali then. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. As heaven's movement is ever vigorous, so must a wise man ceaselessly strive. As heaven's movement is ever vigorous, so must a wise man ceaselessly strive. The voice of Dali's imperial advisor reverberated in the minds of everyone present. The ones from Emperor Xia's realm never knew that the legendary figure who was serving their enemy, Emperor Li of the Dali dynasty, held Yi Futian in such high regard. While the parties were on opposing sides, the imperial advisor had truly taken Yi Futian as his student. He definitely would not have put his neck at risk for Yi Futian under any other circumstances. The ones from the Dali dynasty had left, but everything happening there was no secret, and many from afar witnessed the imperial advisor spare Yi Futian. The first thing that the imperial advisor should have done after Li Yao died was kill Yi Futian right before his eyes. However, he chose to simply leave. Would there still be an imperial advisor of Dali left after this? Yi Futian turned around and walked towards Xia Qingyuan. Xia Rong took one look at Yi Futian and said nothing more. He could tell from his expression that Yi Futian would not understand what he did on that day. He knew that Yi Futian was different from the others. Yi Futian would not have submitted to Xia Rong just because he was a part of Emperor Xia's realm. Yi Futian had a very notable attitude. Xia Rong already knew that because of how Yi Futian dared to go to the Shao clan just to kill Shao Sheng. What was done was done. Xia Rong did not bother explaining anything. It would have been pointless. The imperial advisor of Dali was indeed an opponent deserving respect, yet at the same time, he was also a dangerous opponent. The imperial advisor had to shoulder the responsibility of Li Yao's death. Even if he had chosen to kill Yi Futian, it would have been difficult for him to regain Emperor Li's trust. Worse still, he did not do anything to Yi Futian. The outcome was settled by then. Regardless of how encompassing and tolerant Emperor Li might have been, there was no way he would have forgiven a traitor. What the imperial advisor did that day was tantamount to treason. When he returned, he would probably have to atone for his crimes through death. Xia Qingyuan lowered her head a bit after seeing Yi Futian walking and feeling rather restrained. She never anticipated any of that either. While the actions of her brother were understandable from the standpoint of Emperor Xia's realm, he was nonetheless devoid of honor. What he did put both Yi Futian and the imperial advisor in a bind. It was especially so from Yi Futian's standpoint. What Xia Rong did was unforgivable. As such, she was feeling very terrible at the moment. Retreat from the Crimson Emperor realm and return to Emperor Xia's realm, Xia Rong said at that moment. Everyone turned around to look at Xia Rong. Many heeded his order and followed him, especially those whom he brought. Xia Rong was the deputy general of Tian and held extremely high prestige in the army. The Tian army was the #1 legion in Emperor Xia's realm, so one can imagine what Xia Rong's status was. He was a hardened prince who grew up on battlefields. However, not everyone heeded Xia Rong's orders. He was indeed the eldest prince, but some, like the swordmaster of Lihan, were of the holiness of Nirvana and did not serve Emperor Xia directly, which meant that princes and princesses held no sway over them. Only Emperor Xia had the authority to give them direct orders. Everyone else could only request things of them. That was how it was with the great shaman. While he would have respected the princes and princesses, only Emperor Xia would have been able to truly give him direct orders. As such, the mighty ones were taking a rather peculiar stance after Xia Rong spoke. The swordmaster of Lihan did not budge, looking in Yi Futian's direction instead. He was aware of everything taking place that day. The swordmaster of Lihan had bestowed his sword to Yi Wuchen, and he was not doing that simply because of Yi Wuchen's sword training. Yi Futian played a part in influencing that decision. From the look of things, Yi Futian appeared to be extraordinary in more than just his talents. Even an imperial advisor of an enemy nation, capable of throwing his weight around in his home country, treated Yi Futian differently. As for Lu Yu, he stood behind Princess Xia Qingyuan. Lu Yu had been following Emperor Xia all those years ago, yet at present he was tasked with protecting Xia Qingyuan most of the time. As such, he was partial to listening to Xia Qingyuan's orders instead of Xia Rong's orders. Things on Emperor Xia's side looked rather peculiar at the moment, having lost harmony from when everyone shared the same thought. The atmosphere suggested that something had happened among the men, despite no one saying anything after what transpired between Yi Futian and the imperial advisor. Let's head back to Emperor Xia's realm, Yi Futian said to Xia Qingyuan. He needed to return immediately. Yeah. Xia Qingyuan looked at his eyes and nodded. Many followed afterward as if factions had been split between Xia Rong and Xia Qingyuan. Xia Rong looked at the other side and said nothing. He flashed and moved, getting ready to return to Emperor Xia's realm through the teleportation Grand Matrix. Yi Futian walked up to Shen Tianzhan before he left and said, "Thank you for helping out with the battle, Senior, but it seems that there will be some changes to what was promised. For that, I am sorry. Please be careful out here, Senior." "Will do." Shen Tianzhan nodded. He then looked at Yi Futian and said, "I shall wait for you to return to the Crimson Dragon realm." Despite having participated in a battle fought mainly between those from Emperor Xia's realm and Emperor Li's realm, he was mostly excluded from the equation. The ones that Emperor Li's realm targeted were those from Emperor Xia's realm. He wouldn't have a problem if he was more careful in the future. Yi Futian then looked up at Shen Tianzhan. Waiting for his return seemed to have deep implications. From the looks of things, he and Yi Futian would be on opposite sides in the future. However, Shen Tianzhan said that, instead, he would wait for Yi Futian in the Crimson Dragon realm. Sure. Yi Futian nodded and left with the large group. Shen Tianzhan pondered about something as he looked at the silhouettes disappearing. He knew that both Yi Futian and Yu Sheng had extraordinary talents, but that was all. As such, when Yi Futian requested for him to help out, he agreed. Despite what had transpired, he did not regret participating in the battle. He thought that he had made the right decision. He did not know of the relationship between the imperial advisor of Dali and Yi Futian. However, it was extraordinary for a pinnacle saint to have such breadth of character. The imperial advisor was indeed legendary, and Shen Tianzhan did not think that he was capable of doing the same deeds as the imperial advisor. The imperial advisor did what he did for Yi Futian. He knew little of the young man, but for him to sacrifice himself for another young man showed what kind of character Yi Futian was. If Yi Futian was someone for whom the imperial advisor saw fit to sacrifice himself, there was no doubt that the battle had been worthwhile for Shen Tianzhan. Emperor Xia's realm was imperial, but it was just one realm in the Crimson Dragon region. If Yi Futian were as extraordinary as he seemed, it was only a matter of time before he would venture out of the realm. Many mighty ones from Qinya City witnessed the battle. They were incredibly shaken by what they saw. It was especially so in the case of Kong Xian, Xiang Nan, and the others. Kong Xian stood in the air, her hair billowing in the wind. The parting between the imperial advisor and Yi Futian was something that stuck in her mind. It was unforgettable. There would have been a storm brewing between the Dali dynasty and Emperor Xia's realm soon. A tidal wave would sweep through the inner affairs of the Dali dynasty. The imperial advisor's residence in the Dali dynasty was peaceful and quiet at the moment. He had brought his people to the Crimson Dragon realm. Nanjai and Feishue were the only two students left in the residence. At that moment, Feishue was touching a painting on a table. Nanjai was by her side. He had painted it. "It seems that your art has seen a lot of improvements, second brother," Feishue smiled as she said it. She was unable to see the painting, but she was, nonetheless, able to sense it through her hands. "If you were able to see this with your own eyes, Feishue, it'd be even more surprising," Nanjai said and smiled. "Really?" Feishue smiled faintly. "I too want to open my eyes. I'd be able to see the other elder brothers." "Just the elder ones?" Nanjai asked sheepishly. "No younger ones involved?" Feishue's smile brimmed, and she nodded slightly. "If the seventh swordsman is here, I'd definitely like to know what he looks like." "He is very good-looking." Nanjai smiled and added, "More so than eldest brother and fifth brother." Yen Yuan and Lu Chuan were both considered dashing figures. Feishue smiled, showing her dimples, but then she quickly frowned a bit and seemed to have recalled something unpleasant. She turned her face away and said, "I wonder how father and the others are doing in the Crimson Dragon realm." She did not want to see her father standing against Yi Futian, and she did not want to see either their father or Yi Futian hurt. "Teacher should be able to see it well," Nanjai said. However, his tone sounded rather flighty. It was apparent that he was concerned as well. At that moment, Nanjai extended his will, and he frowned slightly. His expression changed somewhat. His heart gradually sank. "Feishue, it's best to rest early," Nanjai said quietly. "Right." Feishue nodded and left. Nanjai sent her back to her room and then sat cross-legged right outside, closed his eyes, and trained. His will shrouded the vast space around him, and every movement within the shrouded area was unable to escape his notice. Something happened? However, nothing had happened. Everything was still in order, but Nanjai knew that the imperial advisor's residence had been targeted. Few in the entire Dali dynasty dared to keep a close eye on the place. Furthermore, his observation was done at such a sensitive time, so Nanjai was only able to speculate the worst outcome possible. Something might have happened in the Crimson Dragon realm. However, since his teacher had yet to return, he didn't know what had happened. That same day at the royal palace in Emperor Xia's realm, Yi Futian and the others returned. They went to the top of the royal palace alongside Xia Qingyu. The great shaman was around as well. They came to see Emperor Xia in the palace that was surrounded and permeated by clouds. "Please help us out, Your Majesty," Yi Futian said and bowed immediately after seeing Emperor Xia. Emperor Xia looked at Yi Futian and then at Xia Qingyuan. He noted their solemn expressions and then turned towards the great shaman and asked, "Great shaman, what happened?" "Your Majesty." The great shaman bowed slightly and elaborated on what happened in the Crimson Dragon realm, while Emperor Xia listened intently and quietly. When the great shaman finished, the emperor turned to Yi Futian and said, "What would you need me to do?" "I would like you to depart for Dali, Your Majesty." Yi Futian bowed yet again. The only person capable of saving the imperial advisor at that moment was Emperor Xia. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.